Some of the laments they're overwhelming. They are beyond what we could imagine. And then to know, but no, they aren't beyond what some people have imagined and what some people are experiencing right now in our world. And what does it mean to be present in that and trust that God is in it?
Yeah.
And that's the part that then allows it to still be safe.
Oh, you have been our dwelling place for all time.
Welcome to Psalms for the Spirit, a podcast about spirituality and resilience through the lens of the biblical Psalms. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Cynthia Eriksson to the podcast, clinical psychologist, professor, and dean of the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary. Cynthia's work sits at the intersection of trauma, spirituality, and resilience, and she has spent decades equipping individuals and communities to navigate suffering with greater awareness, honesty, and hope. I first encountered Cynthia at a recent conference where she gave a plenary that I found so compelling that I went back and listened to it again when I got home. There was something about the way she spoke about trauma and healing and the Psalms that stayed with me, and I knew I wanted to invite her onto the podcast to share more about that wisdom with me and with you. In this conversation, we explore how the Psalms can be a kind of daily practice for emotional awareness and resilience, offering us language for everything from joy and gratitude to frustration and anger and grief. And we talk about lament as a pathway to healing, the importance of safe spaces for honest expression, and how even in the midst of suffering, the Psalms can help us draw closer to God. I have no doubt that you'll be enriched by hearing from Cynthia today. And whatever it is that brought you here, I am so glad you're with us.
How long, oh Lord, will you forget me forever? How long, oh Lord?
I am delighted to welcome to the podcast today Dr. Cynthia Eriksson. Cynthia and I encountered each other at a recent conference, and I will have had a few guests on from the conference following up because I learned so much. And Cynthia was one who did a plenary that I listened to, and I was so captivated and actually went back to listen to it again when I got home. And there's a wonderful video available if you want to hear the entire presentation and all the other presentations around that. But I followed up with Cynthia trying to see if she would come and talk a little bit on the podcast to help us to see the Psalms in this particular way that she shared about. But before we go into that, Cynthia, I was wondering if you would be willing to share with us a little bit about yourself. How do you like to describe yourself? I will have shared, your official titles and everything, but what would you like us to know about who you are?
Well, I love how you asked the question. I would describe myself as a psychologist who doesn't like to spend as much time in the therapy room. A psychologist who wants to bring psychology and wants to bring our understanding around our human experience of emotions, our human experience of relationships, the things we know about groups, the things we know about how we think and feel, and bring those to the community to build up everyone's capacity, everyone's ability to navigate mental health challenges or build resilience in their mental health, so that fewer and fewer people need therapy in the counseling room.
Yeah.
One of my mentors and teachers when I was going through grad school is Dr. Sang-Yang Tan, who is a scholar in residence at Fuller and a senior faculty member. He used to say, everyone needs therapeutic experiences. Not everyone needs therapy.
Oh, interesting way to put it.
I see myself as someone who wants to empower others to have therapeutic experiences and to train people, equip people on how to provide therapeutic experiences to others, even if they're not in the therapy room.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fascinating. So you have the background of therapy, but you want to take it out of the kind of sequestered room of a one-to-one therapy experience, but to make it accessible to communities and give people access to a therapeutic experience if they can't access therapy, for example, or just in those times when we need to be able to get through something without being able to see a therapist in that official capacity.
Yeah. And I think the way that I would also broaden that is the idea that mental health is something that is part of all of our experiences. It's not just that mental health are mental health problems. Right. I mean, we all have the capacity to grow in our ability to understand our emotions and our ability to navigate complex, challenging situations or conflicts or places of pain or loss. So I think especially I would also describe myself as a trauma psychologist. So someone who has studied trauma, particularly for the majority of my career, even in grad school, was focused on trauma and how building our capacity to process and metabolize difficult experiences and how to be in relationships in a way that allows honest expression of emotion, allows us to be heard and seen, that those are all things that help us navigate traumatic experiences when they happen.
Right.
And they become part of our resilience to trauma. So I think that this piece of understanding that who we are as people, that there are different ways that we're taking care of ourselves, whether that's our physical health or our mental health. I was thinking about, I've used a comparison in a couple different opportunities to speak to groups where I compare dental health and mental health. So if you just kind of humor me for a minute, explain that with dental health, we all have to brush our teeth. If we want to have healthy teeth, we need to brush and floss. And it's going to be better for us the more that we're paying attention to that rhythm and the more that we are caring for our teeth and our gums. And then, in mental health, we need to be paying attention to our emotions and our relationships. We can't just ignore how we're feeling. We can't just ignore things that come up in relationships or difficult spaces. But then even with doing that, with dental health, you need to go to the dental hygienist because even when you're brushing your teeth, there's stuff that's going to get stuck and you need to kind of have some help unpacking it and scraping it off. And then in mental health, there are times that we need others to come alongside us. And that might be pastoral care, that might be a small group leader, that might be a good friend, but it's a place to sort of unpack some of these things and have that other perspective and take out some of the stuff that's building up. But even when we do that, then we also need to go to the dentist because sometimes things become cavities or, and situations that we can't just manage with those small, interventions with the dental hygienist. And similarly, there are times in our lives where mental health gets to the point where I actually need professional intervention in a more significant way, where you need therapy or you need an assessment or you need an opportunity to really sit with a family therapist or a couples therapist to work through with that kind of intentional kind of work. But, not forever, but for a period of time to deal with that place of pain. And then sometimes people need oral surgery, with their dental health, that it might get to the point that it actually needs really significant medical involvement. And I think for mental health as well, there are times that, things are happening and diagnoses are developing that need medication, that might need a hospitalization, that might need long-term therapy or more intensive kind of treatment. So I've kind of shaped that as a way to say, I really see mental health as something that we're all involved in. It's not just that therapy is this place if you have mental health distress or a mental health problem, quote unquote, but it's therapy is one of the spaces, one of the tools for this broader sense of mental health for all of us.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really helpful image. It's very memorable too. The sort of comparison with dental and mental health. And it helps us to kind of get in our heads that regularity of taking care of ourselves. And how we do that with our mental health is by tending to our emotions, being aware of how we're doing inside, and then having those sort of initial ways of taking care of ourselves, whether it's just like writing in a journal and saying, well, I feel this way today, or talking with a friend or a family member. And if we are doing that on a regular basis, then maybe we don't need those interventions later on. But if we do need those interventions, then we know what to do in those cases as well. So yeah, that's really, really helpful. And I love that you have this perspective of making therapeutic experiences available to more people, and that sort of kind of regular taking care of ourselves can be a way of avoiding some of those longer term, more difficult issues that might crop up if we're not, taking care of ourselves in the regular way. So that actually, I think, leads us nicely into the next question, which is specifically about the Psalms. So I wonder if we could see the Psalms as a part of that regular kind of maintenance of our mental health, as a tool to keep ourselves regulated and to notice our emotions. But say more about that. And I know you did cover that quite a bit in your plenary. A word or a phrase that you used was safe spaces for healing. And your plenary was called Trauma and Recovery. I think that was what it was called, right? That's what I had written down. So maybe can you say more about that with relation to this idea of taking care of our mental health on that regular basis?
Yes, I want to give credit to Dr. Judith Herman is the author of the book Trauma and Recovery. Yeah. And that is the book that I was really drawing from a broader structure of what's needed for recovery from trauma. And I would say we're also talking about building resilience to trauma. Yeah. And, that first idea is safety, having safety. And I think what I would see, or how I would see the Psalms as a considerable part of that safety, is the way that just the whole book of Psalms reflects emotion. So to that idea of, the brushing and flossing that we all need to do, that God has given us this extraordinary gift of emotion that is all sorts of things, from incredible delight and joy and amazement at who God is and his creation, to utter despair and darkness and rage and everything in between, that the Psalms just has that space. And it's safe in the sense that it is part of our canon. And that's one of the things I really emphasized in the plenary, is the way that this gift that God has given us to say, I made you with emotions. This book of the Psalms, these songs of our community, has those emotions in them. It's saying, I'm welcoming those. And I want you to pay attention to them, and I want you to articulate them. Yeah. So the fact that the Psalms is a book that is intended for both personal reflection as well as communal reflection, that they would have been sung together as a community, is also reinforcing the development of the community as a safe place to feel those feelings. And somehow I will say, in the U.S. white Protestant church, which is the social location that I'm most familiar with, is we've lost that. We don't create as much space for all of the feelings. There are certain times in our service where we might allow for the sadness of sharing about prayer requests that are really deeply sad, but they often are certain types of needs. Yeah. It's very rarely someone standing up and saying, I'm so angry at my teenage child, and I'm afraid that I might hit them. I don't hear that in church. But the fact that we all experience such a range of emotions and can say, God, where are you in this? And how do I navigate this. That is such a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. Welcoming it, I think, was a really good phrase that you used. And allowing the space to do that collectively, even if we sometimes avoid it if we're uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I'm often surprised at how quickly I will start tearing up in a worship service if I'm not leading. If I'm leading, then it's harder to allow myself to go there. Mm-hmm. But I will sit down and it's like in the safety of what's created in a worship service, if it's held really well and with that welcoming atmosphere, welcoming to our wide range of emotions, it can be so cathartic. And I think it's actually that I would probably be more afraid to have those feelings somewhere else because it would just be so dismal and it would be such deep despair that I wouldn't know what to do with it. But for some reason, in the context of worship or prayer or listening to Psalms or something, you get that sense of the collective. And somehow it feels safer to actually access those emotions. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're raising an interesting question in terms of what are the emotions for? What are they telling us? Mm-hmm. And that despair is itself a tool of saying, I need connection. I need to be seen. I need to be connected to something that feels bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And that might be the community. It might be God. Mm-hmm. It might be an understanding of ourselves as, who God made us to be as, bearers of the Imago Dei. Yeah. And you're raising an interesting question and I think concern around what do we do when the emotions feel so big that they might feel overwhelming? Yeah. And I feel like, to me, that's an important part of lament in that they are like the lament. Some of the laments they're overwhelming. They are beyond what we could imagine. And then to know, but no, they aren't beyond what some people have imagined and what some people are experiencing right now in our world. And what does it mean to be present in that and trust that God is in it? Yeah. And that's the part that then allows it to still be safe, right? Because the emotions will come and they can be real and they can feel so deep and so profound. And then they also get metabolized and move on, to the next thing as we express them. Right. And I feel like working with trauma over the years and experiencing some different situations in my own life that have connections to trauma, it often feels hard to explain this, but often feels more traumatic to be the one not experiencing the trauma. It's like when you're in the trauma, when you're in that pain, it's awful, but you're also experiencing it and you're living it and you're kind of surviving and doing the day to day. And so it's almost like this distance that's is created when we're the observer and we don't know what it feels like to have God and be with God in the midst of that. Yeah. And I wonder if sometimes we end up being afraid to feel it because we haven't yet experienced the sense of God coming up underneath and holding us up in the midst of those things. And I think that's why I use that story in the context of the plenary about working with the student and hearing some of that student's really deep and painful traumas and reading Psalm 88 to the student. And when I asked what it felt like to hear that, because that's such a bleak, scary, honestly, psalm. And for the response to be, it's comforting. Right. To me, that's what I'm talking about. The sense of these laments holding not just the emotion, not just the shared experience of that other people have felt this, but the idea that God is in it, that God sees it, that God's present even when it doesn't feel like God is present. And introduces the opportunity to turn towards God through that conversation, through that time.
How long must I bear the anguish of my soul? How long, oh Lord, and have sorrow in my heart through all of my days. How long, oh Lord.
The other thing I had written down after re-listening to your plenary was the idea of drawing closer to God through lament. And it must have been when you were telling that story, actually, and just that lament is an important part of not only our expression, but actually drawing us closer to God, not more distant, which is maybe not what we expect before we maybe go through something like that.
Right. And for me, the drawing closer to God really, we imagine the parallel in a close relationship where you go through something and really, really awful. And maybe that person was in it with you, or maybe they weren't. But if you don't tell the story, if you don't talk about what you experienced with that person, that there's a distance that gets created.
Yeah.
There's a sense of like, oh, they wouldn't understand, or they think differently of me, or they might judge me, and that's one of the things that happens with trauma is, people start to isolate or withdraw, and it creates even more pain because there's not a sense of being able to process the story or to be seen in it and valued and held in it. So you think about what it means then if we're not sharing that hurt with God, if we're not being honest about what happened, if we're not kind of crying out to God about these experiences, then, do we think that God can't handle it? Do we think that our anger, it may be our questions of why God didn't fix things, will that make it worse? Will it become doubt, which distances me? So the more that we hold on to it, the more it can kind of become a wedge between God and I, as opposed to turning towards God and shaking our fist. I believe it's Serene Jones in her book, Trauma and Grace, talks about sort of shaking our fists at God and lament being part of that. And I find that really important and probably pretty American and individualistic to think like I can myself shake my fist at God. But maybe that's like the communal people of Israel in their laments, like, God, where are you? Why is this happening? And that action is actually an action of attachment. It's wanting a connection. It's wanting, reaching out and connecting to God. And I've used this example before in classes, and pardon my potential reference towards profanity, but it's like the difference between saying F you, God, and F God. It's like F God is like, forget it. I don't want to have anything to do. And it's a turning away, as an F you, God is like, what in the world? Like, what are you doing?
You're directing it to
kind of
to somebody.
Yeah. And it's a bid for connection. It's a bid for, you need to give me an answer or show up. And that's very, think about Job, and, Job's kind of crying out, and God's answer was pretty in his face, and it was strong, but it was a connection. It was like, I hear you, and were you there? And I feel like, to me, that's that piece of, the three parts of Judith Herman's model of recovery: our safety, remembrance, and mourning, kind of telling the story, and then reconnection. And I feel like what we're describing is when you lean into the safety that is there in lament, when you lean into the depth of the kinds of emotions that the Psalms, the imprecatory Psalms, the lament Psalms really share with us, when you tell your own story or see your own story in those Psalms, that's a way to reconnect with God, is a way to open yourself up to that place of God to speak. And, he may speak through your own experience of him speaking in prayer, and what you feel in your heart. He may speak through other scripture. God may speak through other people or ways that, groups come along or circumstances that unfold in nature, in the grandeur of nature. There's so many different ways, but it's being open to experiencing that from God as a way of being in the pain and being connected to God.
Yeah. I think the way you described the relationship is really helpful, because I studied that sequence by Judith Herman as well. And the reconnection idea, it's hard to picture what that would look like in, I guess, when it comes to prayer and the spiritual life. But what I hear you saying is, if you imagine trying to share something you've gone through with a dear friend or a family member, and there is that little bit of distance because I've experienced this and you haven't, even if that person may have been alongside you, somehow there is that disconnection.
Right.
And then to be able to put it into words to share, not just for yourself. I mean, I am a big fan of journaling and just expressing your emotions and just naming, noticing what's going on inside of you, but to actually purposely be sharing it with another person, and then to imagine sharing that with God, to rebuild that connection, and knowing that there's also the receiving side, that it's not a one-way thing. It's God reaching out to reconnect as well and wanting that. And, it's a real hopeful sense of rebuilding that connection.
Yeah. And I think that's where the Holy Spirit comes into, in the sense of, I'm grateful that not every lament has that final upswing, back to praise or thanksgiving or trust. Not all of them do, but most of them do. The vast majority do. But I appreciate what Walter Brueggemann kind of says about that, is that that's the work of the Holy Spirit. That's kind of a surprise that God provides. It's not out of our own efforts. So it's like our posture is sharing the story, and our posture is the being honest. And it's the Holy Spirit's work that brings us back to the praise. And I feel like that way that God shows up and that God can show up is really critically important in the trauma piece too, in the sense that there may be ways that in sharing the story and being honest about the things we've experienced, God shows us ways that he was present. Or God, I keep using the male pronoun for God, but God shows us, God's self in, moments of post-traumatic growth, of a new perspective on things, or a way that we saw God move that reduced the harm or brought people closer together or brought a new understanding of God's faithfulness in that. And that's an important part of trauma as well. That, so much of trauma recovery is stepping into your life again and seeing your life as the whole life and not just that traumatic story. And so some of that has to do with all the things that were happening in life before the trauma happened, but then it's also what has been happening after the trauma and what recovery has brought and what unique experiences, and perspectives, the following chapters are bringing. And I think that is in the laments too, in the sense of, but I will trust in you. And I remember the ways that you were with us. And the whole of the Psalms kind of telling the story of the people of Israel in those songs is part of that journey too.
Yeah. That the post-traumatic growth concept is really important and maybe less talked about, lesser known. And I love the research on that. And I think it's so encouraging to know that there are ways that people can emerge from different kinds of trauma and see growth and change.
But I trust in your
mean, you were saying before we hit record about the fires that have devastated your area of California, and I'm sure you probably saw glimpses of that type of thing there as people have emerged from that. And there's still a lot of devastation, and there's a lot that can't be repaired on a physical level. But is there anything that you've seen that kind of demonstrates that ability to come out of trauma and that post-traumatic growth?
Yeah. I mean, it's an ongoing journey. Even I'm still trying to figure out for myself, the ways that I was and wasn't involved in the traumas. We did not lose our home. We were evacuated, but we lost the home that our kids had grown up in. So the home that, that we lived in when my kids were in elementary school burned down in the fires. But that didn't impact us the ways that, of course, people who lost their home that they were living in.
Right.
So I want to say that with a humility that says, like, I'm still trying to figure out myself.
You're still in the midst of it.
What it's meant to be in this journey. But I will say one of the things that I've seen in my church congregation, my pastor lost his home, Matt Caldwell, Reverend Matt Caldwell. Actually, he's Reverend Dr. Matt Caldwell.
Okay.
And I have been so blessed by the ways that he has been honest and clear about his own experience and the way that he has been willing to bring his own questions and challenges and stories into the pulpit. He chose Ezra as the book to go through in that early sort of journey after the fires and amidst the recovery, and the ways that that book talks about the people of Israel coming back and trying to recover from the devastation of the exile and rebuilding the temple. And the mix of emotions that was, it was so profoundly insightful and growthful. So I feel like that was an important piece for my own, to see his growth in his preaching and in his presence in the pulpit, and the ways that impacted our community, and allowing the ongoing journey of the recovery to be something that our church community was honest and in conversation about.
Right.
It was really profound. And I think there was one, now I'm going to forget which chapter it was. It was either chapter 3 or chapter 4 of Ezra. There's a time where they're talking about the people coming back and looking at the foundation of the temple and the beginnings of rebuilding. And it describes the crowd, and that there was this mix of people who were crying for the sadness of it and people who were shouting for joy at the new growth. And I just thought that was the most profound example of community trauma and community recovery. And that it's both.
Yes, both there at the same time. Yeah.
And I think that, we talk about trauma a lot, and trauma is also a word that can create distance. Because there is trauma in the sense of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a trauma that is a life threat. And, that we kind of each have different sort of categories of like abuse or a disaster or a car accident or things like that are trauma. But I think there's a way that there's also just suffering and what it means for us all as humans to be either in navigating the suffering that we personally have in our lives, or the ways we're navigating and being present with the suffering of others. And I think that's another part of the laments that I'd want to say too. And maybe one of the reasons why they need to be communal is it reminds us of the suffering that's happening around the world and in our local community and in our families. And that even if things feel like, again, that it can be both. I can be having a time in my life that feels really hopeful and positive, and I can also hold, a family member or a good friend who's really struggling. That my capacity to be present emotionally can be both. And that's in the Psalms as well.
That is. And that's a healthy way of handling life as it comes our way, that it's not an either or, it's not a black and white situation where it's either full despair or full, celebration, but it's often a commingling of those, and it's a conversation between the two. It's being honest about where we are experiencing that suffering, but then in the process, sometimes of even sharing that, finding the comfort of community and connection. And yeah, I think that image of your church, it sounds like that was a good model of coming through a difficult experience and sharing and being vulnerable and honest along the way. And then that act itself being a healing thing to do for maybe the pastor and then also for you as a community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much.
So, well, thank you so much. What I want to ask before we conclude is, what would you say that the Psalms have to offer to us today? How can we engage with the Psalms in a meaningful way in today's world?
Well, I find myself amazed at the ways that Psalms end up articulating things that I'm feeling right now, that they give language to places of frustration, and they also give language to requests to God. They give language to promises that I want to hold on to. And whether that's, the promise of bearing fruit in season, if I'm staying in the word, or the promise of being led through the valley of the shadow of death, or the promise of being known even when I was in my mother's womb, or the promise of God hearing my confession and making me, as white as snow. There are so many ways that the Psalms become a place of comfort as we read them. But then I think as we practice them, I think for me, one of a really profound way of receiving the laments or experiencing the laments was to then practice writing some of my own lament, of following the rhythm of, addressing God, and which I mentioned this in the plenary, but that idea of starting with an address of God and who God is at that moment for me in this particular situation. And then saying, what's going on or what has been going on or what promise that I don't feel like has been met. And then saying what I want or what I was expecting or what I hope for. And in that, then maybe the praise comes. Maybe there's a way of seeing the ways that God has been present or the answers that are there that I have been blind to, and maybe there's not. But it's that act of actually going through that journey. Yeah. And shaking my fist or crying my heart out or being really confused or really angry and just trusting that God is in that. So I think the Psalms that articulate that in times where I don't have the words, but then also trusting that I can use that model and that God would also be present and receive my own laments, following the model of the laments that are in Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really helpful. I like how you focus in on the promises too, because that's a way of reminding ourselves of those promises, but then also kind of putting them in what about these promises? But going through the process of, speaking to God, naming the promises, making a request, and then maybe finding some sort of a resolution, but maybe not, and allowing for the possibility that that's where you end for now. But just to follow that model. And I like the way you also started with just naming the frustrations, the lower grade kind of, responses we might have to what's going on, even if it's not a situation of extreme trauma, but the daily anxieties and frustrations and anger at things that are out of our control and those kind of lower grade things that we often hold and we don't know what to do with. And they're not necessarily worthy of going and sitting in a therapy room with somebody and talking about, but they are a part of our daily lives. So back to the idea of tending to ourselves when we're in those moments. It sounds like this is a practice that, would you recommend that as a way of sort of taking care of ourselves?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm glad that you also noted the things that feel out of our control, because I think that's also, as we look at what's happening in the world, in our local communities and our broader communities, there are things that feel really out of our control. And then there's ways that I think the lament can help us be activated.
Yeah.
What are the things that I do have some control over, or I do have a way to respond? And again, like kind of turning towards God for that complaint or that question, and trusting that the Spirit is working, and then listening to what is the Spirit's prompting, what is the Spirit's response in that, and that I'm not helpless.
Right.
That God is with me, and I'm not helpless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. The activation can lead to a sense of agency, and that, there is something I can do. I'm not stuck, and I can maybe go from here, having expressed myself, to, okay, what am I going to do today? Is there some small act that I can do? Maybe courageously, maybe stepping out of what's comfortable. And maybe this is a practice that would be able to give us some strength to do things like that. Thank you so much, Cynthia. This has been a really, really meaningful conversation. And I'm grateful to you for taking the time to come and share with us your wisdom, and share in this kind of, soundbite kind of way what you shared in your plenary. It's been great for me to be able to kind of understand a little bit more. And I think we come away with a lot to actually practice ourselves. So yeah, to be agents in the world, and to know that we have a model that we can follow through the Psalms. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kieran. It was my pleasure to be with you and have this conversation.
Thank you. You've been listening to Psalms for the Spirit with music by Celtic Psalms. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe to Psalms for the Spirit so you never miss another episode. Become a paid subscriber to support this podcast. Your support is very appreciated. And you'll get a Psalms for the Spirit printable journal, bonus material, and invitations to special live seasonal events. Visit my website, KieranYoungWimberly.com, for courses and a membership on spiritual practices for well-being and resilience so that you can flourish and serve. Till next time, may you find healing and hope in the days ahead.